It was only after my cancer diagnosis that I came to the devastating realization: my husband and my best friend had been secretly in love for 7 years, and they even had a child together. I never imagined I'd become the unwitting third party in their sweet, hidden affair. To give them a chance at true happiness, I chose to step aside, genuinely hoping they could find their happily ever after. Chapter 1. The day I received my diagnosis happened to be our 3rd wedding anniversary. This time, things were different. He had told me a day in advance that he had a lot of work at the office and would need to postpone our celebration. Coincidentally, I needed to go for a routine medical checkup, so I quietly went to the hospital by myself. I had expected it to be a minor digestive issue, but it turned out to be pancreatic cancer. When I heard the news, it felt as though I had been drenched in ice-cold water. The chill spread from my head down to my feet. I had overestimated myself. I could only grip the flesh on my wrist tightly, just to keep myself from collapsing in the doctor's office. My first instinct was to call Stephen, the only person in the world who could give me a sense of security. But he didn't answer. The familiar ringtone rang for what felt like forever, until it automatically disconnected. The sound of the busy signal felt like a gust of wind that unknowingly blew away my last shred of strength, making my vision blur. Before my tears could even fall, I heard a familiar voice. "Sweetheart, come here and let Daddy hold you." Then came the bright laughter of a mother and daughter, ringing out in the sterile, medicinal-smelling hospital. The owners of those voices were none other than my husband and his friend. They were sitting closely together, waiting for their report, with a little girl of about 3 or 4 years old in their arms. The warmth and happiness they exuded made my heart ache even more. Pancreatic cancer has almost no symptoms in its early stages, but I could feel its relentless grip on me, bringing pain so sharp I could barely breathe. Chapter 2. The relationship between the 3 of us became increasingly complicated during our college years. Young feelings often sprout quietly without notice. One day, I suddenly realized that, amidst the routine of studying and living, I had fallen for Stephen. At that age, I didn't know how to express my emotions, so I would steal glances at him whenever he walked by. Stephen had been quite the catch even in high school. He was handsome, tall, and had that certain charm that drew the admiration of many girls. Stephen represented my youth. From college to work, whether it was a quiet crush or more direct pursuit, I followed him without hesitation. Through all this, my best friend Lydia had been my greatest support. She and Stephen had grown up together. They had known each other since childhood, practically in diapers. During school days, Lydia would often link arms with me, encouraging me. "Sophie, Stephen loves this soda. After the game, don't forget to give it to him. Don't worry, you'll definitely get Stephen to notice you. Sophie. Sophie." Hearing my name snapped me back to reality. I looked up to see Lydia rushing toward me, ignoring both Stephen and the child. She gripped the corner of her shirt tightly, biting her lip, and looked a little uneasy. When I saw her, my heart tightened again, and I forced a smile. "Hey, long time, no see." Maybe my tone was a little distant, because Lydia stood there for a while, her eyes filled with uncertainty. I could tell she was wondering if I had seen what had just happened. "Yeah, I just got back a few days ago." She glanced at the diagnosis report in my hand. "Is this a medical checkup? Are you feeling unwell?" I waved the report casually, trying to play it off. "Just a routine checkup. It's always good to stay on top of things." Lydia's expression seemed to relax, probably because she was relieved I was okay, or perhaps because she thought I hadn't noticed the earlier scene. Then, as if nothing had changed, she flashed me her usual bright smile, hooked her arm through mine, and joked. "Good thing it's nothing serious. By the way, why isn't Stephen with you?" Her words struck me like a cold wind, and my heart sank. The smugness in her tone was unmistakable. I shot Lydia a cold look. The old me would have immediately called her out on it. But now, all I felt was sadness and self-mockery. After all these years, I had finally come to realize how few people truly cared about me. Seeing Lydia laugh even harder, hugging me a little tighter as if my misfortune somehow made her happier, only made me think back on the past. She had always been like this. On the surface, she seemed concerned about my relationship with Steven. But deep down, it was all about satisfying her own ego. That day during our junior year, at a club party, I finally found the courage to confess my feelings to Steven. It was the first and last time I confessed publicly, but it didn't go as I had hoped. I should have known then that Steven's affection wasn't for me, Sophie. He had always been in love with Lydia, the radiant, sunny, cheerful Lydia, the one who was playful and kind to everyone, but especially gentle with him, the girl he had known he wanted to be with for life, ever since childhood. Not the quiet girl who always stood in the shadow of Lydia's brilliance. Me. Summoning all the courage I had left, I said something I had never dared to say before. It's none of your business. Chapter 3. Lydia's face alternated between red and pale, clearly not expecting me to be so blunt today. How can you speak to me like that? She stammered. That's how I treat bad people. Without thinking, she raised her hand to slap me, but I grabbed it quickly. Then, I raised my other hand and slapped her back. Her eyes reddened with fury, and she tried to charge at me, but the security staff stepped in to stop her. It was clear that Lydia wouldn't let this go easily. She had never been one to back down. Suddenly, a child's innocent voice, clear and pure, reached us from a distance. It immediately caught her attention. Sophie King, this isn't over. She spat out a final threat and stormed off, her heels clicking angrily against the pavement. I stood where I was, looking up at the sky, the clouds drifting lazily by in the wind. In that moment, all the anger seemed to drain away. I didn't know what to do next, who to talk to, or even whether to go back to that so-called home. I looked down at my phone screen, where a photo of Steven from our wedding day stared back at me. He didn't like taking pictures, much less posing for one with me. Nearly every photo I had of him was taken secretly. I gave a bitter laugh and thought about changing my wallpaper to a picture of a stray cat I had seen earlier. As I fiddled with my phone, Steven's call came through. After a moment's hesitation, I answered. His familiar voice immediately filled my ears. He was much gentler with me now, compared to when we were younger. I figured it was the result of our long relationship. But at this point, it didn't matter anymore. Hello, I said. Hey, I was in a meeting. The company's been busy today, and I've been working late. He was lying. Are you still at the hospital? I'll come pick you up. He added. It sounded almost like charity. Steven always seemed to think that if he gave me just a little kindness, I should be forever grateful. No matter what happened between us, he always tried to make up for it with small gestures, expecting me to forgive everything. When I didn't respond, impatience crept into his tone, but he asked again, his voice softer. Sophie, are you still at the hospital? I'll come pick you up. It took a little effort, but I finally found my voice. Clearing my throat, I answered. I'll wait for you at the hospital entrance. Some things needed to be addressed face to face with Steven. Even though Steven was already at the hospital, he deliberately circled the area several times in his car before parking in front of me, pretending as though he had just come from the office. I tucked the diagnosis report into my bag and walked toward his car. If I didn't already know he and Lydia were at the hospital, I might have been fooled by his flawless act. But I wasn't about to let them have it their way. They wanted me to silently endure this injustice, but I would expose their hypocrisy and shatter their perfect little romance. Chapter 4. Steven's hand rested on the steering wheel, and he hadn't looked at me once since I got into the car. His fingers lightly tapped on the wheel as he said, Let's go to my parents this weekend. Mom wants to see you. She wants to see me? I glanced out the window at the passing scenery, finding it laughable. Steven's family was cut from the same cloth as him. They knew exactly who was suitable for a relationship and who was suited for marriage. They chose me over Lydia because they thought I was docile and easy to control. His mother was a force to be reckoned with. She was notorious in the village for her temper and unreasonable behavior. Most neighbors avoided her. His father, on the other hand, was a pushover who always yielded to her. Before we got married, Stephen's father had done all the household chores. A few years ago, an accident left his father paralyzed, and he could no longer manage the housework. So, I became their unpaid labor. This so-called desire to see me was probably just an excuse for his mother to get me to do more chores. Seeing my silence, Stephen seemed uncomfortable with the coldness and furrowed his brow. Finally, he impatiently ordered, "I'll take you there." Anger surged inside me, and his command made it overflow. "I'm not going." "Sophie, what's wrong with you now?" he snapped. Clearly displeased, he glared at me. I avoided his angry gaze. "Nothing's wrong with me." I could see his lips moving, about to say something, so I interrupted him, throwing a bombshell. "Today at the hospital, I saw someone who looked a lot like you." Stephen's expression froze. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel, and he instinctively slammed on the brakes. In the silence, I met his panicked eyes and spoke as gently as I could. "And that man had a child with him, a daughter." He broke into a cold sweat and coughed before responding. "You must have been mistaken. I don't have any children." I continued, my expression softening. "Yes, we've been married for years without children. If you did have a child, it would mean you had someone else on the side." Something in my words seemed to hit a nerve, and Stephen slammed his fist on the steering wheel. His voice turned harsh. "What do you mean, someone else? You're getting more paranoid. I'm busy at work and still have to deal with you. Can't you give me some space?" I watched him, not wanting to miss any of his exaggerated expressions. Suddenly, I wondered why I had clung to him for so long. Stephen continued. "Don't you have your own life? After all these years, you're always bothering me with everything. Can't you be a little more sensible?" I swallowed the nausea rising in my throat and forced a pale smile. "Of course I can. During today's checkup, I realized I've been too dependent on you. From now on, let's give each other some space to cool off, okay?" Stephen's expression softened. He had always enjoyed my submissive attitude, and he seemed pleased when I showed humility. He deliberately shook off my hand and restarted the car. "It's best if you don't bother me." I pulled my hand back, my palm red from the earlier contact. "Then let's start with a cooling-off period for a divorce." Chapter 5. Chapter 5. What the hell are you doing? Stephen's first response was to blame me. I hadn't expected him to think I was just being irrational, even in this situation. "I'm not playing around, Stephen. We need to get a divorce." He pressed his lips tightly together and restarted the car, clearly trying to avoid the topic. As if pretending it didn't exist would make it go away. I repeated myself, forcing him to confront the issue. "I'm not willing to continue playing this ridiculous love game with you." Stephen dropped me off at the apartment and drove away without saying another word. I stood on the sidewalk, watching his car grow smaller in the distance. Gradually, a strange sense of calm settled over me. Even if he refused to agree, I was resolved to find a way out of this marriage. For the past 7 years, I had been the only one kept in the dark in this twisted relationship. To Stephen's family, I was little more than a free housekeeper, a servant who took care of all their domestic needs. It was like a string of pearls. Once you find the first crack, everything starts to unravel. Take, for example, the incident from a year ago when I bought a $30 pack of boneless chicken feet. My mother-in-law had thrown a fit, dumping the entire plate on me and flipping the table in the process. 2 years ago, while helping my father-in-law, he fell, and in his anger, he kicked over a nearly full chamber pot. Over the past 3 years, I had suffered countless indignities. And Stephen? He had always stood by, watching coldly, only to lecture me later from some moral high ground. From the very beginning, they had never seen me as an equal. The streetlights glowing brightly around me seemed to mirror the growing resentment inside. It wasn't just my relationship with Stephen, my relationship with his parents and Lydia was just as twisted and suffocating. For most of my life, I had bowed and scraped, serving them, putting up with their mockery and mistreatment. But now, I was done. Chapter 6. Once home, I methodically went through all the assets Stephen and I had accumulated over the years, including cash, savings, and investments. The only clue that stood out was that Stephen regularly transferred money to a secondary account every month. I recognized the card. It was the one he used to pay his parents' living expenses. What struck me as odd was the amount being transferred. It was far higher than what we had agreed upon. If it had been within a reasonable range, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. But I knew Stephen's salary, and the sum he sent his parents was 5 times his base salary, far too excessive. It seemed that, besides Lydia and their child, Stephen was hiding something else from me. To find out what that was, I would need to go back to his parents' place and retrieve that card. The next day, I went to a well-known law firm in the city to gather information on how to collect evidence of infidelity. Afterward, I took a cab to the hospital and legally requested the surveillance footage from the hallway where Stephen and Lydia had been the day before. I saved it onto a USB drive as concrete evidence. As for their chat records, the child's hospital files, and the paternity test results, I could request them during the court proceedings. Divorce was inevitable at this point. The next step was to make Stephen, Lydia, and their families pay for what they had done. I wasted no time and immediately contacted several advertising agencies to create a banner exposing Lydia as the other woman. I also reached out to a few influential relationship bloggers, asking them to help spread the story on social media. The power of rumors and public opinion would be my first blow to Lydia and Stephen. Chapter 7. After posting everything online, I deliberately bought traffic and created multiple fake accounts to amplify the story, wanting to make sure it went viral. Watching the heat rise, I felt a strange satisfaction, as if the sharp pain of my pancreatic cancer had lessened a little. I hadn't realized that making the people I despised suffer could bring such a twisted sense of relief. Looking back, I'd been far too kind to myself all these years. Stephen was more frantic than I had imagined, calling me over a dozen times. I purposely let him wait before answering. As soon as I picked up, he didn't even give me a chance to speak before yelling into the phone. "Sophie, where the hell are you? Have you completely lost your mind?" When he found me, his face was dark with fury, especially when he saw me casually sipping a milk tea. His rage twisted his expression beyond recognition. "I have one condition," I said coolly. "If you agree to the divorce, I'll delete all the posts." Stephen scoffed, then pulled a divorce agreement from his bag and threw it in my direction. The document was clearly designed with his interests in mind, offering me next to nothing. I smiled, a small but cruel curve of my lips, and pushed the agreement right back to him. "I want you to leave with nothing," I said, my voice steady. Before I could even blink, Stephen threw his hot coffee at me. It happened so quickly that I didn't have time to react. As I looked up with a cold smile, the heat of the coffee seeped through my clothes, scalding my skin. But I didn't flinch. "Sophie King," Stephen spat. "Have I been too lenient with you? You did a little housework, took care of my parents. So what? Why do you think you deserve to leave with anything?" He snapped. The waiter nearby was watching the scene unfold. I waved him over and ordered a cup of hot water. When it arrived, I didn't hesitate. I poured it straight onto Stephen, savoring the sound of his painful yelp. "Because I can decide your fate," I said, my voice laced with cold satisfaction. Before I turned to leave, I kicked Stephen hard in the back of his knee, forcing him to the ground, making him kneel before me. I looked down at him from above, my gaze chillingly indifferent. "Stephen, I gave you a chance." Chapter 8. To give them a taste of their own medicine. Early on the weekend, I carried a large bag of meat and wine and headed straight to Stephen's parents' house. After knocking for half an hour, my mother-in-law finally opened the door, her eyes glaring like saucers. I had experienced this scene many times before, but back then, I was deeply in love with Stephen and never thought of fighting back. I walked in, slamming the door behind me, and threw the bags into the kitchen. From the moment I entered, my mother-in-law had been watching my every move. Seeing me slam the door and not greet her, she was furious. I ignored her, washed my hands, and stared at her coldly. My indifference only fueled her anger. She slapped my arm, the sound echoing sharply. I winced, clutching the stinging spot. Seeing her menacing look, I couldn't hold back any longer. I turned to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and slammed it on the table. "Martha, you have hands and feet. Why should I serve you? Who do you think you are?" Martha flinched, then yelled, "Isn't it your duty to take care of me? You're my son's wife. It's your job." She slapped me again, making me dizzy and almost knocking me over. "Why are you hitting me?" Martha was strong from years of farm work, and her aggressive nature made her even more powerful. She grabbed my hair, pulling me towards her. She kept cursing, spitting in my face. Not satisfied, she pinched my arm hard, twisting it. I screamed, losing my mind. Somehow, I found the strength to slap her back, scratching her face to free myself. Instinctively, I grabbed the knife from the table and held it to her throat. "Try touching me again. Go ahead, kill me. Do you think I'm scared?" Chapter 8 continued. Despite her bravado, I could hear the tremor in her voice. She was scared. But I had nothing left to fear. After all, I didn't have much time left. I walked to the kitchen, grabbed a fresh piece of pork, and shoved it into Martha's mouth. "Mom, I think your words are too filthy. Use this to rinse your mouth." She struggled with all her might, but as soon as she opened her mouth to curse, I stuffed it full of raw pork, making her gag. When I let go, she collapsed to the floor, retching and crying out for help. "Son! Stephen! The crazy woman you married has lost her mind." I ignored her and went into Stephen's father, George's, room, heading straight for the corner where the chamber pot was kept. I picked up the pot, filled with filth, and dumped it on George, who lay helplessly in bed. Unable to move, he could only gape in horror as the contents splashed over him. George, that old scoundrel, had often used his condition to make me help him with his needs, deliberately dirtying me. Now it was his turn to feel the filth. I tossed the pot aside, washed my hands, and left without looking back. Chapter 9. Teaching those to a lesson felt incredibly satisfying. Standing outside the old apartment complex, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, anonymously reporting Stephen for embezzling funds for personal use. By the time Martha and George went to complain, Stephen would already be in deep trouble, unable to help them. My next target was Lydia, now without Stephen's protection. "Sophie King! Have you lost your mind? I told you to take care of my parents. What the hell are you doing?" I deliberately responded in a sweet, playful tone. "Yes, dear, I haven't been feeling well lately. I even went to the hospital for a checkup." Stephen's anger was palpable, and I could imagine his furious expression on the other end of the line. "You're crazy! Why did I ever marry a lunatic like you? If only..." He stopped mid-sentence, but I knew what he wanted to say. "If only you had chosen Lydia back then, right?" His anger subsided a bit, and I heard chaotic background noise on his end. I turned up the volume, catching snippets of conversations about Mama's boy. Severe punishment. And can't control himself. Before I could hear more, Stephen's furious roar interrupted. "Shut up! All of you, shut up!" Soon, the authoritative voice of law enforcement maintaining order came through the phone. Hearing Stephen's sudden panic, I softly said, "Sweetheart, it sounds like you have some things to deal with. I'll hang up now." Meanwhile, netizens were relentless. During our conversation, they had already dug up all sorts of information about Lydia, including her social media accounts, home address, and workplace. I guessed she would soon face waves of public scrutiny and condemnation. To amplify the effect, I hired online marketers to post and guide public opinion, making the scandal even bigger. The bigger the storm, the harder it would be for Lydia to escape. "Lydia, I was curious to see how you would handle the oncoming tempest." Chapter 10. 3 days later, Lydia finally called. She was clearly in a bad state, launching into a tirade as soon as I answered, her usual calm and haughty demeanor completely gone. "Lydia, let's talk." "Talk? What is there to talk about? You know everything, don't you? You posted all that online to ruin me and Steven." Ignoring her accusations, I laid out my terms. "Agree to meet, and I'll have the posts deleted and handle the situation. How about that?" Mentioning deleting the posts made Lydia hesitate. The past few days of constant abuse had clearly taken a toll on her. "What do you want to talk about?" "About Steven. After we meet, I'll divorce him. Do you want your daughter to grow up with the stigma of being an illegitimate child? Besides, we were classmates. We didn't get to talk properly at the hospital last time. Will you keep your word?" "Of course." After hanging up, I immediately contacted the accounts that had posted the scandal and had them delete the posts. I also made a public statement on my social media, urging rational discussion and promising to handle the matter privately and legally. Taking a cab to Lydia's apartment complex, I followed the information I found online to her home. As soon as I stepped out of the elevator, I saw wreaths and hateful banners outside her door. Pushing through the mess, I knocked. I heard some noise inside. Lydia probably checked through the peephole before cautiously opening the door. "Come in." Lydia looked terrible, far from her usual polished self, with red eyes and deep dark circles. It was worth the trip just to see her like this. Neighbors peeked out to watch. Lydia's face turned even paler, and she snapped at them. "What are you looking at?" Most people retreated, but a few stood their ground. "Oh, just a homewrecker. Why are you yelling? None of your business. I didn't break up any family. Then why do you have a child without being married? Must be an illegitimate child. Better watch out for bad influences. My daughter is not illegitimate." Talking about her and Steven's child, Lydia's face turned red with anger. She pulled me inside, slamming the door behind us. I sat on the couch, and Lydia stood nearby, arms crossed, wary. "What do you want to talk about?" "I'll tell you everything. Does Steven transfer money to you regularly?" She rolled her eyes. "Of course. I had his child. He has to pay child support. Did you know that money is embezzled from his company?" "What? That's impossible." I met her shocked gaze with a mocking smile. "Seems you're not that important to him after all." Lydia knew I was telling the truth. She stood there, lips trembling, probably worried about being implicated. A little girl peeked out from a room, her innocent face watching us. I smiled warmly at her, then took a gift box from my bag and handed it to Lydia. "A thank you gift. Thanks to Steven, I can make him leave with nothing." Seeing her reluctance, I placed the box on the coffee table. "I'm leaving." I pointed to the little girl. "Don't scare the child with your arguments." I had planted a seed of doubt in Lydia's mind. Given her nature, it would grow. Unfortunately for Steven, he wouldn't have a chance to explain. To see him, Lydia would need to apply for visitation. I wouldn't give Steven any respite. After dealing with Lydia, I contacted the lawyer I had consulted earlier. I filed a civil lawsuit and patiently waited for the court date a month later. Chapter 11. This was the first time I had seen Steven since my diagnosis. The embezzlement scandal had worn him out. He looked haggard, with a scruffy beard and sallow complexion, but his anger was still evident as he glared at me. His expression told me he was cursing me in his mind, using the vilest words. But to me, it was just the roar of a powerless man. During the trial, the court reviewed all the chat records between Steven and Lydia over the years and confirmed the existence of their daughter, Emily, and her relationship with Steven through hospital records. With ample evidence, the case proceeded smoothly. The final verdict was that Steven would leave with nothing and pay me $2,000 in emotional damages, a sum he could barely afford now. As the verdict was read, I looked at Steven in the defendant's seat. He seemed to age instantly. He gave me a look I couldn't decipher: anger, regret, perhaps, but it didn't matter anymore. From now on, we were done. "Sophie," Sophie King! As I left, Stephen called my name, something he rarely did. In the past, it might have moved me, but now I didn't even want to hear it. Lydia, however, responded by slapping him hard. That made me turn back. Not for any other reason, just because I found the two of them amusing. Martha was the first to speak, her voice shrill. "Lydia, you used-up woman, how dare you hit my son?" Lydia slapped Stephen again, shouting, "You worthless man! You gave me money you stole from your company. If you hadn't promised me money, I wouldn't have had your child." Stephen, losing his bravado, hung his head, saying nothing. "Stephen, you're a coward. You lied to me for 7 years." Seeing him like this, Lydia grew even angrier, hitting him again. Martha couldn't stand it and tried to help her son. By the time people intervened to break up the fight, the place was a mess. And I walked away, leaving it all behind. Chapter 12. Stephen's affair and embezzlement made headlines, turning him into a local scandal. I didn't have to lift a finger, the public did the rest. Lydia was quickly fired from her job for damaging the company's reputation. She became a pariah in the city. After the embezzlement case was settled, she had no money to support Emily. The little girl, still young, had fallen ill recently. After much thought, I softened and gave Lydia some money to help them through. After all, the child was innocent and couldn't choose her family before birth. Consider it a way to accumulate some good karma for myself. I put our house on the market, hearing that both Martha and Lydia had come looking for me but didn't find me. The only thing I took from the house was my diary. It contained all my thoughts over the years, stories about Stephen Wells and Lydia Taylor. The house sold quickly. With my diary and the money, I sought out a renowned specialist to start aggressive treatment. For chemotherapy, I shaved my head and burned all my diaries. It was a way to say goodbye to my past self and embrace a new life. Since distancing myself from those who weren't good for me, I felt reborn, even my treatment was going better. Bed 24. Time for your medication. The nurse came in with my doctor, one of the most talented young physicians at the hospital. He stopped by my bed, smiling beneath his mask. "You're recovering well. After 3 more rounds of treatment, we can consider surgery." Encouraged by his smile, I obediently took the medication the nurse handed me. Looking out the window, the events of the past few months flashed through my mind like clouds in the sky. Perhaps, if not for this illness, I wouldn't have had the courage to change my life's trajectory. The sun was shining, the breeze was gentle, and I was filled with hope for the future. After enduring so much, it was finally time for me to enjoy happiness and peace.